Hello students, so in this presentation I shall discuss about the topic known as constraints used in MySQL. Now this shall be the part 1 of the topic called constraints in MySQL. So what do you mean by the term constraints in MySQL? Constraints are the database objects which helps in maintaining the integrity of data in a MySQL database. That means constraints are those database objects which ensures that the data remains consistent inside a database. With the use of constraints, we restrict any sort of inconsistent data to be stored inside a database. One such constraint that you have already encountered is the primary key constraint. The primary key constraint doesn't allow duplicate data to be stored inside a database. Because if there are duplicate data that exist inside a database, it may lead to anomalies or errors in the database operations. So to prevent such anomalies and inconsistencies in the databases, constraints have been developed to ensure integrity of data in the MySQL database. In addition to the primary key constraints, you have also encountered the foreign key constraint, the enum constraint, and the set constraint. There are in fact many more types of constraints which I shall be discussing in the subsequent slides. Now look at point number 2. You can create a constraint for a column in a table in two different ways. In the first way, you can create a constraint at the time of creation of a table. That is, at the time of creation of a table, using the createTable statement, you can impose a constraint on a column. Now if you look at this command, it creates a table named employee having three different columns, which are employee ID, employee name, and designation. Now here I have created a constraint named employee ID underscore pk for the column named employee ID at the time of creation of the table named employee. And the type of constraint that I have imposed on this column named employee ID is the primary key constraint. So this primary key constraint doesn't allow duplicate entries to be stored in this column named employee ID. So any value that you try to insert into this column named employee ID has to be unique or distinct. Now if you look here, this entire constraint declaration, which is to be imposed on the column named employee ID, is done at the time of creation of the table named employee. So just as how you have defined the columns employee ID, employee name, and designation inside the body of this table named employee, in the same way this constraint has also been declared inside the body of this createTable statement. So that is what has been said here. A constraint can be created at the time of creation of table using the createTable statement. Here I have declared the primary key constraint at the time of creation of the table named employee. Now the second way to impose a constraint for a column on a table is after the creation of a table, and that is with the help of the alter table statement. Now look at this createTable command, which creates this table named employee. If you look at this table now, I have removed the constraint declaration that was imposed on this column named employee ID. So now this column employee ID is free from any constraints. Previously, I have imposed this primary key constraint on the column employee ID. So duplicate entries were not allowed for this column. Now that I have removed this constraint declaration, so now as this column name employee ID is free from the primary key constraint, so now it can accept duplicate entries. So now let's create this table named employee by clicking on this run button. Now as I clicked on this run button, the table named employee has been created. Now let me insert two records for this table named employee. So at first, let me insert the first record, that is one for employee ID, John for employee name, and Clark for designation inside this table named employee using this insert into command. So for that, I have selected this command and then I have to click on this run button. So the first record has been added into the table named employee just on clicking this run button. Now let me verify it by typing the select command. So now I shall type this command, that is select star from employee, just to verify whether this record 1 John Clark has been inserted into our table named employee or not. So now I have highlighted this command and then I shall click on this run button again. So look over here, the first record, that is 1 John Clark, has been added into our table named employee. Now note one thing here, that the employee ID is 1. Since I haven't applied the primary key constraint for this column named employee ID, so I can be sure that duplicate entries shall be accepted by this column. So now I can insert another record using this insert into command, where I take the employee ID as 1 again. Only the employee name and the designation is different from the previous one. So let me insert this record by clicking on this run button. So the second record has been added. Let me verify it by typing and executing this select command. So I have selected this. Now I shall click over here. Now look over here, the table employee now consists of two different records. Okay, the first record is 1 John Clark and the second record is 1 David Clark. Now note here is that the column named employee ID is taking duplicate entries of 1. So why this is so? This is because I haven't imposed the primary key constraint for this column named employee ID. Now primary key constraint is the most widely used constraint. The primary key constraint ensures that the columns on which it is defined must contain unique values for all the rows or records. So the primary key column shall contain only unique values. It must not contain duplicate values. Now by eliminating the duplicate values for a column by imposing the primary key constraint, it helps to maintain entity integrity in a table. Now since I have already defined and declared this create table statement to create the table named employee, I have to impose the primary key constraint for this column employee ID using the alter table statement. So since I haven't imposed the primary key constraint for the column named employee ID at the time of creation of the table, now I have to use the alternative route. The alternative route is to impose that constraint after the creation of the table using the alter table statement. So as this table named employee has already been defined with these columns where the column named employee ID has not been imposed the primary key constraint. Now what I'm going to do now is to impose the primary key constraint for this column named employee ID using the alter table statement. Okay, and that has to be done after this create table statement. So let me execute this alter table statement now. So here is this alter table statement. With the help of the statement, I'm trying to alter the table named employee to add a constraint for this column named employee ID. Let the constraint name be empid_pk. Since the constraint to be imposed on this column employee ID should be a primary key constraint, so just after adding the constraint name empid_pk, I shall put the keyword primary key. Okay, so just after adding the constraint name empid_pk, I had put the keyword primary key followed by the name of the column within bracket on which this primary key constraint has to be imposed. Since the column name is employee ID, the primary key constraint has been imposed on the column employee ID. So now if you look at this command has been declared and defined after the creation of this table named employee, because the table body ends here with a semicolon and this statement is clearly outside. Now once I execute this statement, you will notice that the duplicate entries of 1 for the column employee ID will not be accepted. Okay, so let me execute this command by clicking on this run button. Now see, just as I have executed this command, I can see the error message saying duplicate entry 1 for the primary key column belonging to the employee table. So this means we can't have duplicate entries of 1 for the primary key column employee ID for our table named employee, because I have imposed this primary key constraint for the column named employee ID using this alter table statement. We can avoid this error message by not inserting duplicate entries of 1 like this. If the previous entry is 1 for the column employee ID, then the next entry cannot be 1 again. Take a different value such as 2. So by putting unique values for the employee ID column, both these records can be uniquely identified by the employee ID column, okay, because they have unique entries. The employee ID 1 uniquely identifies the first record belonging to the employee named John, whose designation is clerk. In the same way, the employee ID 2 uniquely identifies the second record whose employee name is David and designation is clerk. And that is how the primary key column maintains entity integrity in a table, by eliminating inconsistent and duplicate entries inside a database. So just look at the syntax of adding a primary key constraint. In this example, here employees is the table name, empid_pk is the constraint name, and employee ID is the column on which the primary key constraint shall be imposed. So employee ID is the column name. This example is based on this syntax of declaring a primary key constraint. The next type of constraint that I shall be discussing now is the not null constraint. Now all of you already know that missing values in a database are represented as null. Now let's say the table named employee consists of these two records. Okay, both these records are uniquely identified by the primary key column employee ID. Okay, the primary key column has the value 1, which identifies the first record belonging to the employee John, and again it has the value 2, which uniquely identifies the second record belonging to the employee David. Now if you look at both these records, the entries for their columns are filled up. In the first record, the entries for the column employee ID is 1, for the column employee name is John, and for the column designation is clerk. Similarly, in the second record, the entries for the column employee ID is 2, for the column employee name is David, and for the column designation is clerk. Now what if I insert another record into this table where I don't want to put any value or entry for the column named designation? In that case, I have to store null as the entry for the column named designation while executing the insert command. Now look over here. Okay, with this insert command, I am trying to insert another record with employee ID having the unique value as 3, the employee name as Ram, and since I want to keep the designation as blank or empty, for that I am putting null here. So null here is going to indicate that the value under this designation column for this particular record will be missing. Now once I execute this command by clicking here, this row shall be added into this table. Okay, now let me verify it by executing this select command. So now look over here. Okay, the third record has been inserted into our table named employee. Okay, but with 3 as the entry for the column employee ID, Ram as the entry for the column employee name, and the entry for the column named designation is blank, okay, or missing. This is due to the fact that I have put the keyword null in this insert into statement for leaving the entry under the designation column as blank. But sometimes it is not desirable to leave these fields as empty. In that case, I can make use of this not null constraint. So a column having not null constraint does not allow null values. Now if you look at our table named employee, the column designation hasn't been imposed any type of constraint. Now what if I impose the not null constraint for this column name designation? In that case, the third record showing the designation as empty will not be applicable. That means I can't leave this field for the column called designation as empty like this once I apply the not null constraint for the column named designation. Now let me add the not null constraint for this column. Now one thing to be noted here is that I can't put the not null constraint over here because the table has been already created, and at the time of creation of this table I haven't imposed the not null constraint for this column named designation. Okay, so I can't put it over here again. Instead, I have to make use of the alter table statement to add the constraint not null for this column named designation. Now look over here. I am trying to alter the table named employee by writing alter table employee so as to add the not null constraint for the column named designation. So for that I have to write the keyword modify followed by the column name. Okay, since I am going to modify our column designation, okay, so I will put designation here. Along with that, I have to specify the data type varchar along with its size 15. Okay, so I'm going to specify that here, and then I'm going to put the not null constraint. Okay, I'm going to put this not null constraint for this column named designation, and I end the command with a semicolon. Okay, now let me execute this command by clicking on this run button. So once I had executed this command, I can see the error message as invalid use of null value. That means now I can't put the value null for the column named designation for this third record belonging to the employee Ram, which was inserted into the table using this insert command. This is due to the fact that I have imposed this not null constraint for this column named designation, which will never allow null as an entry for the designation column. So now let me delete this entire third record, okay, where the entry for the designation was missing. For that, I have to execute this delete command. Okay, I shall type like this: delete from employee, okay, where I'm going to filter the record where employee ID is equal to 3, because I'm going to delete only this particular record whose employee ID is 3. Okay, so delete from employee where employee ID is equal to 3. Okay, I have selected this command and I'm going to execute this command by clicking on here. Now let me verify it using this select command. So the third record, okay, where there was missing value for the designation column has been removed. Now if I have to create that third record again belonging to the employee Ram, I can't keep the entry for the designation as missing or null. So for that, while trying to insert this third record using this insert command, I can't keep the entry as null for the column designation. Let me keep this third entry as clerk as the designation. So let me select this command and execute it. Now let me verify it using this select command. Now see, the third record has been inserted, okay, but the value for designation which was initially missing is now clerk, and that is all made possible by executing this command, okay, which modifies the column named designation, okay, belonging to our table named employee, such that empty values cannot be assigned to this column, and that is due to this not null constraint when it is imposed on this column designation. So that was all about this not null constraint, which doesn't allow missing values for a column. Now let's discuss about the third type of constraint known as the unique key constraint. The unique key constraint is similar to the primary key constraint, except the columns having unique key can accept single null values. That means if you impose the primary key constraint for a column, it cannot accept null values. But instead of that primary key constraint, if you impose the unique key constraint for a column, then it's going to also accept the null values. Now let me show that with the help of an example. Now if you consider this table named employee again, okay, it has three different columns. Okay, the first column, employee ID, has been designated as a primary key. This is because I have altered this table employee to add this primary key constraint for the column named employee ID. using this alter table command. Now since a primary key column cannot accept null values, I can't have null as an entry over here for the primary key column, that is employee ID. So let's find it out. Now let me insert another record into our table named employee, okay, where the primary key column employee ID is null. The employee name should be Raj and the designation should be clerk. Okay, so this record will be the fourth record to be inserted into our table named employee. Okay, now will it get inserted? See, the first entry is the entry for the primary key column employee ID. Okay, but this entry is null as indicated here in this insert command. Now if I execute this insert command by clicking on this run button here, okay, so once I have executed this command by putting null for our primary key column employee ID, it shows an error, that is invalid use of null value, because the primary key column employee ID cannot accept null value. This column has been designated as a primary key with the help of this alter table statement. As a result, this fourth record will not be inserted into the table. But what if we use a unique key constraint instead of that primary key constraint? In that case, if I impose that unique key constraint on our column named employee ID, then it's sure to accept the null values. Now let me put that unique key constraint for the column employee ID instead of that primary key constraint. For that, I have to write the alter table statement like this, okay, alter table employee, because I shall be altering our table named employee, okay, in such a way that I have to add a constraint, okay, by writing add constraint, and then put the name of the constraint, okay, which is empid underscore uk. Okay, so uk is just an abbreviation for denoting the unique key. So empid underscore uk is the constraint name, and since I shall be imposing the unique key constraint, okay, so for that I need to type unique key followed by the name of the column within bracket. Since I shall be applying that unique key constraint for the column employee ID, so I shall write employee ID as the column name for which this unique key constraint shall be imposed. Now let me execute this command. So the unique key has been imposed for the column employee ID. Now let me check the records by executing this select command. So as of now we have 3 records for our table named employee. Okay, those are the records having employee ID as 1 for John, employee ID as 2 for employee David, employee ID as 3 for the employee Ram. Now let's say I wish to insert another record into our table named employee, okay, where the employee ID is kept as null. Okay, that means the value for the employee ID column shall be null or missing for this record. So now let me execute this command by clicking over here. Now let me verify it by executing this select command. Now look over here, see the 4th record, okay, the value for the employee ID column is missing. Okay, this is due to the fact that this insert command, which puts the value null for the employee ID column, displays the record for the employee Raj like this, that is with the employee ID missing. And that is all made possible after executing this alter table statement, because instead of the primary key column which I had imposed earlier on this column named employee ID, I am now using the unique key constraint. Okay, look at this unique key constraint. A unique key constraint, if imposed on a column, okay, also allows the column to take null values. Okay, so for this reason, since this unique key has been imposed on the column employee ID, so employee ID is taking null values or missing values. But if I apply the primary key constraint instead of this unique key constraint, then in that case I will not be able to keep this field as blank for the employee ID column, because a primary key column will never accept null values for its column. So that's the difference between a primary key and a unique key. Okay, a primary key uniquely identifies every record in a table. Okay, so is the unique key, which also identifies every record in a table. But a primary key column cannot accept null values. Okay, whereas a unique key column can accept null values. Okay, for this reason, since this column employee ID has been imposed a unique key constraint, okay, that's the reason I can see null values for our column named employee ID. After executing this insert into command, where I have put null as an entry for this employee ID column. So here null here indicates the missing value for the employee ID, Ras here indicates the employee name, and clerk here indicates the designation. So unique key is similar to primary key, except columns having unique key can accept null values. Now look at this point. It says more than one unique key can be defined on a table. That means you can define more than one unique key for a table. Okay, but that is not the case for a primary key. Okay, you can have only one primary key for a table. Okay, you cannot have more than one primary key in a table, but you can have more than one unique key for a table. Unique key also helps in maintaining entity integrity. Okay, so just as how the primary key helps in maintaining the entity integrity, in the same way unique key also helps in maintaining the entity integrity. It doesn't allow duplicate entries to be stored inside a database. Now keep in mind this point, that you can have only one primary key in a table. Okay, but you can have multiple unique keys for a table. Now see the syntax of adding a unique key constraint. Okay, now this example is based on this syntax. Okay, here alter table employees here denotes the table name. Okay, emp id underscore uk denotes the constraint name. Okay, then you have the unique key followed by the name of the column. Okay, so here employee ID is the column name. Now this syntax is very much similar to the syntax for declaring the primary key. For declaring the primary key, I use primary key here, and for declaring the unique key constraint on the column employee ID, I use unique key here instead of primary key. Now in today's presentation, I have discussed about these three types of constraints, which are the primary key constraint, not null constraint, and the unique key constraint. Okay, in the part 2 of the presentation, I shall discuss about the enum constraint, set constraint, default constraint, and the foreign key constraint. So with this, I end my presentation here.